When a super empath finally goes no contact, it doesn't create silence. It creates an emotional earthquake. The avoidant thinks they've won until the very moment they realize the person they thought would always be there has quietly walked away. And suddenly the one who needed space is the one gasping for air. There's a moment in every connection with an avoidant where the empath feels the truth hit them. I cannot keep showing up for someone who refuses to meet me halfway. Super empaths love deeply. They listen, they feel, they connect on a level that most people never unlock. But the mistake is thinking that this ability to understand someone also means they should tolerate emotional starvation. And that's where things begin to shift. Because when a super empath finally goes no contact, it's not a game. It's not manipulation. It's a reclamation of emotional energy. See, avoidants are used to space. What they're not used to is losing access. They're used to the empath, reaching out, soothing conflict, repairing the connection, interpreting silence as an invitation to dig deeper. But when the super empath steps back, they do it with clarity. They do it because they realize their love deserves reciprocity, not resistance. And here's the twist. The avoidant interprets no contact very differently. At first, they think it's relief, space, exactly what they're comfortable with. But then something unexpected happens. The empath doesn't come back. The emotional safety net disappears. The person they always assumed would understand them, forgive them, and wait for them is suddenly unavailable. The avoidant's subconscious panic activates, not because they suddenly crave intense closeness, but because the dynamic that protected their emotional distance has collapsed. The avoidant misses the empath's warmth. Then they miss their presence. Then they miss their absence being temporary. This is the moment the avoidant realizes that the empath's love wasn't a guarantee, it was a gift. And the power of the empath's no contact isn't about punishment. It's about truth. When the empath pulls away, the avoidant finally feels the impact of what they've been keeping at arm's length. And for the first time, they're confronted with a version of reality where they can hide behind distance because the distance has swallowed the relationship whole. The super empath's strength reveals something the avoidant never expected. Their fear of intimacy was never stronger than their fear of losing someone who cared for them unconditionally. No contact isn't the end, it's the awakening for both sides. When a super empath decides to go no contact, it isn't born from spite, manipulation, or an attempt to trigger a reaction. It comes from a very real moment of emotional exhaustion. Super empaths have a high capacity for compassion, patience, and emotional presence. They can read moods, sense shifts in someone's tone, and pick up on unspoken fears. Because of this, they naturally give more than most people. They soothe conflicts, create emotional safety, and make their partner feel understood in ways few others ever have. But this gift comes with a cost. The empath often ignores their own needs while trying to bridge the emotional distance created by an avoidant partner. Over time, the empath starts to feel the imbalance. They notice how often they are the one initiating the conversations, repairing misunderstandings, or holding space during silence. They see themselves offering reassurance while receiving uncertainty. They begin to realize that their emotional bandwidth is being used to support a connection that doesn't support them back. This isn't a sudden realization. It's a slow build-up, like water rising behind a dam. One day, the empath feels the pressure too strongly to ignore. Something in them snaps, not in anger, but in clarity. No contact for an empath is rarely impulsive. It's a boundary they reach after trying everything else. They've communicated their needs, offered compassion, created room for their partner's fears, and tried to understand the emotional distance. When all of that effort is met with consistent withdrawal avoidance, the empath finally sees that continuing to pour themselves into the situation isn't love anymore, it's self-sacrifice. Their decision to step away becomes a reclaiming of their emotional energy. For the first time in the relationship, the empath's focus shifts from how can I make this work to how can I protect myself. That internal shift is powerful. It's the moment they stop trying to rescue the dynamic and start choosing themselves. And because the motive is self-preservation, the no-contact boundary is firm. Empaths are naturally forgiving, but once they've reached this point, they're not seeking closure or reaction. They're seeking peace. They're seeking space to reconnect with their identity, their confidence, their emotional grounding. They need to breathe again without feeling the weight of someone else's avoidance on their chest. This is why their silence carries such impact. It isn't loud, dramatic, or punitive. It's calm, final, and rooted in self-worth. It reflects the moment when an empath stops bending to keep a connection alive and finally stands up straight. Avoidants are comfortable with distance because distance feels safe. It allows them to remain connected without feeling overwhelmed, close without feeling engulfed. So when a super empath pulls away at first, the avoidant doesn't panic. In fact, their initial reaction might look like relief. They interpret the silence as space, something they've relied on their entire lives to regulate their emotions. From the outside, it can seem like they don't care or aren't affected, but internally, they're simply responding in the only way they know how, by retreating deeper into the comfort of emotional distance. What the avoidant doesn't understand, though, is that this familiar sense of relief is temporary. It lasts only as long as they believe the empath's absence is just a phase. In the past, every time there was tension or emotional intensity, the empath would eventually return, checking in, offering reassurance, trying to repair the bond. The avoidant becomes conditioned to expect that cycle. They unconsciously rely on it. It allows them to maintain distance without ever facing the true consequences of that distance. But when the empath's absence continues longer than expected, something begins to shift. At first, the avoidant notices the missing messages, the missing emotional warmth, the missing presence. Not in an overwhelming way, more like a subtle, nagging emptiness. They tell themselves it's fine. They tell themselves they don't need it. Yet day after day, the quiet becomes more noticeable. The lack of communication stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like loss. The avoidant becomes unsettled, even if they don't admit it aloud. Their internal dialogue begins to shift from finally, I have space to why haven't they come back yet? They might replay old conversations, scroll through past messages, or create excuses to justify reaching out. They start to sense that the empath's silence isn't the usual cooling off period. It's something different, something they didn't prepare for. The avoidant isn't panicking because they suddenly want deep intimacy. They're panicking because they've lost the emotional balance they depended on. The empath's consistent presence acted as an anchor, keeping the connection alive even when the avoidant pulled away. Without that anchor, the avoidant feels the very thing they spend their life avoiding, emotional vulnerability. They are forced to confront the possibility that the person who once felt so safe, understanding, and patient may truly be gone. And in that moment, the avoidant realizes that what they thought was comfort was actually complacency. Distance only feels safe when the other person is still within reach. When the empath stops returning, the avoidant discovers that space without connection isn't relief, it's abandonment. When the super empath finally goes no contact, it creates a rupture in the dynamic that the avoidant has carefully maintained for a long time. The avoidant could keep their emotional world at arm's length because the empath consistently compensated for the distance. The empath interpreted silence, withdrawal, or emotional shutdown as signals to lean in, not back away. This gave the avoidant a kind of emotional safety net, one they relied on far more than they realized. So when no contact occurs, it forces the avoidant into a position they're deeply uncomfortable with. They must face the emotional consequences of a behavior they've always believed protected them. Avoidants rarely recognize the impact of their distancing while it's happening. To them, stepping back feels like a survival instinct. It's a way to maintain control, regulate overwhelm, and shield themselves from perceived threats of closeness or expectations. But this instinctive retreat also prevents them from seeing how their actions affect the person who cares for them. It blinds them to the gradual erosion of the connection. They often assume the bond will remain intact because it always has. No contact disrupts that assumption. Suddenly, the avoidant can't rely on the empath's emotional labor to keep the relationship afloat. The usual cycle, avoidant withdraws, empath pursues, avoidant stabilizes, comes to an abrupt halt. In the silence, the avoidant begins to feel the emotional echo of their own behavior. They're confronted with the void they helped create, and without the empath rushing in to fill it, they must sit with the discomfort. This is where the panic sets in, not always as visible anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, irritability, intrusive thoughts about the empath, or a sudden awareness of loneliness they can't explain away. They might scroll through old conversations, linger on the empath's social media, or rehearse reasons to break the silence. The avoidant begins to realize that the distance they insisted on came with a cost they never calculated. The loss of someone who genuinely understood and cared for them. The emotional consequences they once avoided now come rushing forward. They feel the absence of warmth, attention, and safety that the empath once provided. They feel the weight of unspoken apologies, missed moments, and the neglected emotional opportunities that were once available but are now slipping out of reach. For the first time, the avoidance strategy doesn't feel protective. It feels damaging. The avoidant wanted space, but they never wanted emptiness, and no contact forces them to confront the difference. Empathic love is powerful because it's attentive, intuitive, and emotionally generous in a way that few people ever get to experience. A super empath doesn't just listen, they understand, they feel, and they anticipate. They show up with consistency even when the relationship becomes difficult. They hold space for the other person's fears, doubts, and defenses. Their care is grounded, steady, and often unconditional in its expression. But when this kind of love meets an avoidance instinct to withdraw, something dangerous begins to happen. The empath's contributions get taken for granted. The avoidant becomes accustomed to the idea that the empath will always be there. They rely on the empath's warmth without acknowledging it. They lean on the empath's emotional labor while pretending they don't need it. The avoidant's fear of intimacy makes them keep the relationship at a distance, but the empath's capacity for connection keeps the bond alive despite the space. Over time, the avoidant starts to see the empath's love as a constant, something endlessly renewable, something that doesn't run out. But empathic love is not infinite. It has depth, but it also has edges. And when the empath goes no contact, those edges become painfully visible. The avoidant is confronted with something they did not expect, the realization that the love they assumed would always be available has limits. The patience they relied on was not an inexhaustible resource. It was a choice made every single day, and that choice can stop. Silence becomes the moment where the value of that love suddenly comes into focus. The avoidant begins to replay the ways the empath showed up. Small gestures, emotional support, forgiveness, understanding, and recognizes that those moments weren't automatic responses. They were intentional acts of love that required vulnerability and emotional generosity. With the connection suddenly cut off, the avoidant feels the absence of that generosity in a way they never had before. What makes this so impactful is that the avoidant never truly believed the empath would walk away. They assumed the empath's sensitivity meant they were tied to the connection, unable to detach. But the no contact boundary reveals the truth. The empath wasn't staying because they couldn't leave. They were staying because they cared. And when caring becomes self-damaging, even the most loving person will step back. This shift shatters the avoidance illusion of security. It forces them to see the empath's love not as an obligation, but as a rare gift, one that can be lost. The avoidant begins to understand that emotional generosity is not something they can withdraw from indefinitely without consequences. They feel the difference between having someone who loves them and losing someone who genuinely saw them. And in that realization, for the first time, they learn the true value of the empath's love. The no contact phase becomes an awakening because it shifts the emotional dynamic for both people in ways that neither of them can ignore. For the super empath, the silence is not an escape but a healing space. They finally have room to hear themselves again, to notice their own needs, their own exhaustion, and the emotional weight they've been carrying for far too long. Without the constant effort of trying to decode the avoidance reactions or soothe their anxieties, the empath begins to reconnect with their inner strength. They start recognizing how much of themselves they had been giving away in an attempt to hold the relationship together. In this space, clarity forms. They begin to see patterns they missed before, boundaries they ignored, and the emotional self-neglect that had been masquerading as love. This period also gives the empath a chance to rebuild their identity outside the relationship dynamic. Their world expands again. They rediscover hobbies, friendships, ambitions, and parts of themselves that had been overshadowed by emotional labor. It's not that they stop loving or caring. It's that they finally start caring for themselves with the same intensity they gave to the connection. Their confidence returns, their intuition strengthens. They begin to understand that walking away wasn't abandonment. It was self-restoration. For the avoidant, the awakening looks very different. No contact disrupts their typical emotional rhythm. It forces them to experience the full impact of losing someone who once felt safe, grounding, and accepting, even if they were the ones who pushed the connection to the point of collapse. The sudden absence of the empath's presence leaves a void they struggle to rationalize. They may have spent years believing that closeness equals danger, but now they're faced with a new kind of discomfort, the discomfort of emptiness. The avoidant begins to question their assumptions about relationships and connection. They start to realize that distance doesn't always protect them. Sometimes it isolates them. The walls that once felt comforting now feel confining. And for the first time, they're confronted with the truth that their fear of vulnerability didn't spare them from pain, it simply postponed it. The no-contact silence magnifies this realization. Without the empath's gentle reassurance softening the edges of their insecurities, the avoidant must face their emotional patterns without buffering. This dual awakening, one towards self-worth, one towards self-awareness, creates a shift that neither person can ignore. The empath emerges from the silence stronger, clearer, and more grounded. The avoidant emerges more aware of what their defenses have cost them. And while the silence may separate them, it also reveals truth that could never surface while the old cycle was still in motion. When the super empath steps back and goes no contact, it reshapes the entire emotional landscape of the relationship. It highlights what was unbalanced, exposes what was unspoken, and brings clarity to both people in ways that constant communication never could. The empath discovers their strength not by holding on, but by finally letting go of what was draining them. And the avoidant is confronted with the truth that distance doesn't shield them from loss. It only delays the pain of realizing what they failed to nurture. No contact becomes the crossroads where self-respect meets emotional truth. It isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about choosing healing over chaos, choosing clarity over confusion, and choosing growth over cycles that go nowhere. Both the empath and the avoidant come face to face with the real consequences of their patterns, and it's in that stillness, away from the noise, away from the chasing, away from the withdrawing, that each person finally sees the relationship for what it truly was. And perhaps the most powerful part is this: the end of communication becomes the beginning of understanding. For the empath, it's an awakening of self-worth. For the avoidant, it's the realization that love is fragile, valuable, and never guaranteed. In the silence, both sides hear the truth they were too entangled to face before. Thank you for giving your time, your attention, and your openness to this message. If you saw yourself in any part of this journey, whether as the empath, the avoidant, or someone navigating the space between, you've already taken the first step toward deeper awareness and healthier connection. Remember, growth is not measured by how tightly you hold on, but by how bravely you choose what truly serves your heart. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, and until next time, thank you and goodbye.